fanatics. It's College Football with Sam on with special guest James Kapp. You may notice that there is a little bit of a different look. I didn't implement everything that I wanted to in this relaunch of Touchdown Talk. This is episode 9 of Touchdown Talk. But behind me, you'll see I have a legitimate background. It's no longer a green screen. And I even have a Michigan-Ohio State hybrid flag. And in the next coming episodes and weeks before the regular season kicks off, you'll see a lot of changes in the background. Let me know if you want anything to be added, just because I know that the more diehards we can get to like the show and appreciate little things, the better. So I just wanted to let you know about those changes, and I'll let you know about any other changes along the way. But what we want to talk about today is really reacting to day 1 and 2 of media days. Day 3 is tomorrow, and Oregon, Washington, Michigan, Indiana, Minnesota, and one other program, I think Maryland. Those are the 6 programs tomorrow that will have the spotlight, and their coaches will be speaking, their 3 player representatives will be speaking. But all the other 12 teams, we want to touch on them a little bit today, along with Ohio State being picked preseason number 1 in the conference, and many people have them preseason number 1 overall. Michigan's roster is loaded, but Oregon's and Penn State's rosters are pretty loaded as well. And out of all those teams, a team that I actually have special affection for this year, because I love potential and I like teams that have easy schedules, more importantly, genius offensive coordinators. Penn State is a team that I love to talk about, especially in comparison to last year where I thought they were overhyped. But let's get into business, and first and foremost, James Kapp is someone who's been following my channel for a while, and I've been following his channel. We do things a little bit differently. He's big and popular on Instagram and is very successful there. I am here on YouTube, growing, but he produces great content over on his Instagram, and he's pretty active on other social media sites as well. So I encourage you to visit anything that he has to offer. Down in the description, you'll see his link tree, and you can see basically all the sites that he operates on. How are you doing, James? And what did you think about Big Ten Media Days so far?
Yeah, first of all, Sam, appreciate you having me on today. I'm excited to talk about Big Ten football. Thank you for that introduction. And yeah, we finished up day 2 of Big Ten Media Days, and day 1 with Ohio State, you could see the huge crowds following Ryan Day around. This is a year where the Buckeyes, like you said, a lot of people, a lot of the media has them ranked as the preseason number 1 team. And in my opinion, rightfully so, the amount of players that they brought back, the things they were able to do in the transfer portal, you can make an argument they brought in the 2 best players in the transfer portal in all of college football. Definitely a team that's getting a lot of hype. Oregon and Michigan tomorrow. We saw USC today. So yeah, really exciting time for football fans. We're almost there. We've almost made it through the offseason.
Amen. I'm honestly a little bit impatient for the regular season to begin, but there's a lot of upgrades that I want to make, and also a lot of exciting things to still cover in the preseason, so I'm thankful for that little buffer month, little over 4 weeks that we have until August 24th when everything kicks off. A little bit off script here, but what do you think about Florida State and Georgia Tech? Like, do you make anything of that game, just briefly, or is it a free win for Florida State in a pretty open week?
Yeah, so I was looking at Clemson and Florida State. I was going through their depth charts about a week ago, and I was talking to a couple of my buddies about Florida State, and one of them mentioned Georgia Tech, and he said, well, yeah, Georgia Tech, they got some guys this year. I was like, really? Because I hadn't looked at their roster, I hadn't looked at their coaching staff, anything like that. So I made a quick glance at it. I couldn't name thoroughly all their starters and whatnot, but they do have some solid players. And with DJU transferring there, his 3rd school in 4 or 5 years now, and all of the players that Florida State lost after last year, I mean, who knows what to expect? Yeah, Georgia Tech. I have to, delve deeper into their roster, but it could be a really good game.
Yeah, I look at that game, and given that Florida State's offensive coordinator Alex Atkins is suspended for the first 3 games, and Florida State has a lot of new pieces, and they aren't as deep as a typical team that was as great and as efficient as they were last year is. Like they don't have a top 15 talent roster yet, and last year and 2022 were their first years of really consistent success. And with how weak the ACC was, I'd just say last year was their first great team in a while. But I'm high on them this year, and that's what fascinates me is I think I'm just also high on Georgia Tech. Like I think at the end of the year Florida State will be really good and one of the best teams in the country, but Georgia Tech's offense should be one of the best in the ACC, if not the nation, because if Haynes King just doesn't throw picks and the O-line continues to improve under Brett Key, that's his specialties, the O-line, that should be an awesome game. Let's get back to the Big Ten, though, because I like talking about the ACC, the SEC, the Big 12, but the Big Ten is what we want to talk about today because it's an 18-team league, at this point the largest league in college football in collegiate athletics. And I want to start it off talking about Michigan. Michigan, they didn't showcase themselves. They didn't make an opening statement. Sharon Moore didn't, and they haven't been interviewed, their players, yet. That's tomorrow. But Michigan's roster, I think, and I've made several comments and videos about this with a lot of evidence, their roster is still loaded despite the fact they only returned 40% of their production and only one offensive starter. A lot of the offense has rightful questions, but you figure that some balls will bounce Michigan's way there, some won't. But the defense, do you think that the defense can yet again be one of the nation's best, even with all they lose? Because I think they can.
Yeah, it's Michigan's really interesting because, going back to last year, like you said, they lost a lot of their production, but with the 13 players drafted, I believe only 2 of them went in the first or second round. So many of those guys were third, fourth, fifth round talents. And now you look at the roster and maybe they don't have as much depth all the way around, but their top end talent, I can't remember a team that had, a Mason Graham who's projected to be a top 10 pick overall, a Will Johnson, a top 5 pick overall, Kenneth Grant. Defensively, I think initially when they lost Keon Sabb, that was pretty surprising to me. And I felt like that was a big loss. And then you hear Rod Moore. Yeah. And then Rod Moore tears his ACL in a non-contact injury. So then you start to worry a little bit because then they also lost Mike Sandersill. They lost Josh Wallace. But you still have Will Johnson. You still have Makari Page. And then what Sharon was able to do in the portal, I think it was in a span of 2 days, they landed 4 total transfer defensive backs. Mangum from Michigan State, Walker from Louisville, Hall from Albany. He was an All-American in the FCS. Johnson from UNLV. I don't know if they're going to be able to, besides Will Johnson, Makari Page, be at that same level as Rod Moore, Mike Sanders, still like that. But having that depth and that competition, because with DJ Waller, another guy, he transferred to Kentucky. It was sort of, okay, I guess Jair Hill is going to be the starting cornerback too. Now he's got a lot of competition for that spot, and that's just going to make him better and everybody else in that secondary room better. And then defensively, on the defensive line, you look at Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Derek Moore, Josiah Stewart. Those were the 4 guys on the D line against Alabama on that goal line stop. I think all 4 of those guys have a chance, especially Kenneth and KG, but even Josiah, seeing the kind of year he had last year, Derek Moore, if he continues to develop, all 4 of those guys could be first, second round picks with the draft this year or next year. Picking up another big transfer with Jayshon Barham, who has started at Maryland since he was a freshman. That was huge. We have Ernest Hausman going into his second year at Michigan. In my opinion, and I might be a little biased because I'm a Michigan fan, this is going to be the best defense in college football, in my opinion.
Interesting. I think they have the potential to be the best defense in the nation. I have already come out and said I think they're going to have the best defensive line in the country, and I think their front seven, potentially. I haven't exactly decided on that, but I'm leaning toward it. I do think with the concerns of upside at secondary, like you mentioned, Mike Sainer still, Will Johnson, Rod Moore, and then having Keon Sabb, who I think could be an All-American at Alabama, where he's projected to start along with Malachi Moore. And I think, look, with him in a starting role and another year of development, I think he's going to be really good. In hindsight, that was a painful loss. I don't know if I'd tab them as the nation's best, but they're up there in the same tier or close to the same tier as Iowa, Ohio State, Penn State. Some would put Oregon up there. I think you have to put Georgia up there, given that last year was a little down for their defense and what they bring back. I'm honestly very excited to look at the defense and watch how they respond to an offense that's taking several steps back. What do you make of, specifically looking in again on defense, Michigan plays Texas, they play Oregon, Ohio State could have a great offensive line because they bring back a ton. USC's reshuffled their offensive line, brought back some players. Minnesota might have the best tackle duo in the country. Michigan is going to be facing great offensive lines, physical offenses. Darius Taylor for Minnesota at running back. Bucky Irving's gone for Oregon, but Jordan James is back. And then Travion Henderson and Quinshad Judkins. That's quite a duo to prepare for. Same with C.J. Baxter and whoever backs him up at Texas. How do you think that this front will fare against physical offensive lines, and several of them throughout the year, unlike last year where they really only played two, and not having the offense to control the clock, at least to guarantee control the clock like they did last year? What challenges do you think this defense will face, and how will they face against them? How will they do?
Piggybacking off of what you just said with, Michigan's offense last year being able to be so dominant and sustain those long drives that allowed the defense to rest and, stay on the sideline. We don't know how that offense is going to look. So with the defense being on the field presumably more often, depth is definitely a concern. You look in the secondary, you look at linebacker, you look at the defensive line. There's a lot of question marks. And like you said, Texas, game 2, they open with Fresno State. You're going to see a lot of shuffling in that game. They're going to try to prepare a lot of guys because, Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, yeah, they're great, but they can't play every single snap. Derek Moore and Josiah Stewart, they're great. They can't play every single snap. So I think, with all those great offensive lines and all those great running backs, when those starters come out for Michigan, if there's a significant drop-off, things are going to unravel really fast. So that would be my biggest concern, is the depth for Michigan's defense.
Yeah, I'm in lockstep there with you. I've been pouring through offensive lines and looking at teams, Big Ten, but more so outside of the Big Ten, because I'm pretty well-versed on the Big Ten now, about as well-versed as I can get on depth charts and players, especially for the teams that look to be successful this year. And something that I noticed is that while Michigan probably has potentially the 2 best defensive tackles in the country, at least 2 defensive tackles that are top 10, top 5, you have Rayshon Benny behind them, maybe a Noetta, but that's it. Meanwhile, whether it's Georgia or Alabama, Oregon more so at tackle rather than guard, they have multiple players that can just rotate in, and they don't need to play their players for every snap of the game. And, if they rotate, they'll suffer a drop-off. They won't. But Michigan could very well do that, especially, I think, at defensive end, where you lose Jalen Harrell and Braden McGregor. At defensive tackle, it was just Chris Jenkins that left. And defensive tackle last year was already deeper than defensive end. So I completely agree with you there. Speaking of physicality in the offensive line, what do you think when you look at Michigan's offensive line? What are concerns? What are areas of potential improvement, if any? And who do you think is the best player? And also the player with the most questions?
Yeah, I'm higher on Michigan's offensive line than most. I've made a couple posts on Instagram about it. I like what Sharon did with the portal the last couple of years. Now, obviously, they lose six total guys. They lose their entire starting lineup, plus Trente Jones, who started the last couple of games due to Zach Center going down. But you have a couple of guys, and Greg Crippen at center and Giovanni Alhadi, who have been waiting their turn now for going. This is year 4 for them both, where they finally get to start. I mean, Gio, he sat behind Zach and Trevor for 3 years while they started. Most guys would have transferred and they would have left, but he trusted the process. He stayed there. He's gotten bigger, faster, stronger. Greg Crippen is a bigger center than most. He's almost six. I think he's 6'4", almost 6'5". 310. Came from IMG Academy. Very smart kid. They were able to pick up Josh Preby from Northwestern, who was a captain, a kid that grew up in Michigan and has a lot of love for that program. The concern for me, I like how the interior looks. The offensive tackles are my question mark. I know Miles Hinton's going to be the starter at left tackle, but what concerns me is that last year he was starting the first couple of games, and then he got pulled out and replaced by Ladarius Henderson. And it was an issue with, how quick his feet were, how his pass blocking was, because he's a big guy. He's about 6'7", 330, 340, but he wasn't quick enough, and the pass rush was getting there. And then right tackle, I think what's projected is that Andrew Gentry is going to start. I think he went on a 2-year mission trip, if I'm correct on that. Came back last year. Yeah, got his body back in check, and he's another really big kid. I think he's almost 6'8". So it's not a concern with, are these guys big enough and strong enough. I'm concerned about, are they fast enough in pass blocking, and do they have enough in their tool bag to stop different pass rush moves?
I understand that. Yeah, there's certainly a lack of experience with Gentry. And then Miles Hinton, I think second year with the program and in the system will take a step forward, but he was not an elite or even near elite great offensive tackle last year. He was not one of the best or NFL ready, so there are questions there. And with center Greg Crippen, I think that he's ready, and I think that the interior of that offensive line will be better than many people expect. Michigan will take a step back, but I don't think they'll take as big of a step back as many think. And then real quickly, at the quarterback position, I think that Alex Orji is going to start. I have heard that some people think Jack Tuttle will start or make a push. I think Orji's athleticism is too big of a trait to ignore and to give up on. And I think in the spring game, he showcased that he's at least good enough of a passer to where if you design open routes for him, use a lot of motion like what Sharon Moore has done, that you can put him in a position to win and create plays for the offense. Receiver, to me, is almost a bigger question mark than quarterback. There's Tyler Morris, Samaj Morgan, Frederick Moore. I think Michigan has a lot of speed at receiver, but it's a lot of raw, untested talent, and not all of those balls can bounce Michigan's way. That just won't happen.
Yeah, I feel like, it's sort of a lazy comparison just because so many people have used it. But obviously, Alex Orji, he was the scout team quarterback for Michigan against Alabama in the Rose Bowl. And so many people have compared Alex Orji to Jalen Milroe. But I see a lot of similarities. And you go back and you watch Jalen Milroe's film from last year and how shaky he was earlier in the year. And then he kind of settled in, got a little better at passing in the pocket. But I could see Alex Orji being that type of player. Now, back to what you said, where it hasn't been announced that he's the starter. And Kirk Campbell's been interviewed multiple times, and people have tried to get the answer out of him. Is Alex your starting quarterback? And he's, well, Alex is doing a good job. Jack's doing a good job. So I don't know. I would probably put it at a 70-30 right now that Alex Orji is the starter. But
Okay.
Jack Tuttle, reportedly, I mean, the dude's doing a great job in camp. He's doing a little bit better of a job at making reads than Alex is. And going to, the receiving room, like you said, it's a lot of raw talent. We know Samaj Morgan's really fast, but he's a smaller guy. Tyler Morris is a smaller guy. We saw him put the burners on that drag route against Alabama. Frederick Moore had a really nice catch and run in the spring game. And them being able to go in the portal and snag a couple of guys. CJ Charleston is someone that I'm excited about. I think he'll be a reliable target, very good hands. Not a big receiver, but I think he's about 6 foot, 200 pounds. And then getting a Morian Walker back, that was big. I think when they tried to move him to corner, that really, hit him the wrong way. He did not like that at all. And I think that was a big reason he went to Ole Miss.
Interesting.
And yeah. And with, him not getting playing time there last year, Sharon, well, he was only there for the spring, but, Sharon talking to him again when he entered the portal saying, hey, man, we'll let you play receiver if you come back here, because they didn't have anybody above 6 foot in the receiving room that, could be a dignified starter. So that was a big pickup to get Amorian back.
Agreed, at least in part for depth. I don't know how he'll do as a receiver, and I know that he's not projected to start right now. Before we move on, name your top 5 players for Michigan on offense and defense.
Defensively, I put Will Johnson at 1, Mason Graham at 2, Kenneth Grant at 3, Jayshon Barham at 4, and Makari Page at 5. Offensively, I'd probably go Colston at 1, Donovan at 2. I'll put Giovanni Alhadi at 3. I think he's going to be really, really good this year. It's my sleeper player. I'll put Samaj at 4. And then projecting that Alex as the starter, I'll put him at 5. I think he's going to be a really good dual threat. I think his running ability is going to be really good for Michigan.
Yeah, I released a poll asking who it was between Alex Orji, Luke Altmaier, Will Howard, and Drew Aller who'd have the most rushing yards. And the unanimous pick was Orji. Now that's just people's opinions, of course, but it seems like everyone kind of has that view that if he's going to start, his running ability will really come through and shine. My top 5 players, offensively, it would have to be Colston Loveland at 1, Edwards at 2. I would say it's hard. I'm very high on Hinton, but I'm also very high on Crippen. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go with Greg Crippen at 3, Hinton at 4, and then I would go with Preby at 5. Defensively, it would be Will Johnson 1, Mason Graham 2, Kenneth Grant 3, Josiah Stewart 4, Derek Moore 5.
I like that for a defensive lineman. I like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that there are some depth concerns on the D-line where you'd almost rather have, like, Ohio State's depth or even Iowa's compared to Michigan. But that starting 4, you can't... Oh, shout out to Penn State, too. I think their D-line depth may even be better than those other 2. But for just the pure starting 4, you cannot compete with that defensive line. Even Phil Steele, who didn't rank them at first, said that. He just has a lot of concerns with the depth, which is understandable.
Yeah.
So speaking of defensive lines, many, including Phil Steele, have Ohio State's D-line as number 1. And they were picked by the preseason Big Ten media poll with 8 first-place votes to finish first in the Big Ten. The only other school to receive first-place votes was Oregon with 5. Interesting. That is from IndyStar.com. I wonder... Oh, there's the Cleveland.com one. So my apologies. That one isn't the main one, but it's only Ohio State and Oregon in the Cleveland.com poll that even have first place votes too. Ohio State has 21 and Oregon has 6. So Ohio State's the runaway pick. Oregon follows close behind. Penn State and Michigan are almost tied for third, but Penn State has a little bit more of a lead, and then there's a big drop-off after those 4. What do you make of Ohio State being picked preseason number 1? I know you said they deserve it, but do you think there's any potential issues with that, or do you think, yeah, they should be the unanimous one until proven otherwise?
Well, I mean, considering everybody that they brought back, what they were able to do in the portal, I think it makes perfect sense. Now, Oregon has a really, really good team this year, so that's, why they're getting some of those first place votes. But looking at, their defensive line, their defensive backs room, their receiving room, their running backs, they arguably have 4 or 5 of the best rooms in the country for their respected positions. So I get it. I understand. Now, I have a lot of question marks about Will Howard. There was the concern that if he returned to Kansas State, would he have even been the starter, or would he have been the second string? So I get that. But I don't think he has to do too much with this offense. Chip Kelly now calling the plays, Ryan Day giving up his play calling for the first time since he's been there. And Ryan's talked about how much history Chip has running the ball and how much he's told Ryan since being there that we are going to be a run the ball first team. Now it's Ohio State, so they're going to throw the rock around, but having Quinshon Judkins, having Travion Henderson, Donovan Jackson coming back at left guard, them being able to get McLaughlin from Alabama. I believe they return their starting tackles, Fryer and Simmons. They're going to be a really good team. Howard's not going to have to do too much, and he's a big kid, 6'4", 6'5", 235.
He can truck people.
Yeah, if he can, run some of those RPOs, some of those quarterback keepers, and just fall forward and get 4 or 5 yards on those first downs, that offense is going to be so tough to stop.
Oh yeah, if he can just have kind of an Aller level scrambling ability where you just always fall forward, yep. And then, I mean, honestly, this almost sounds demeaning, but if he just played like how Drew Aller did last year, except more accuracy, especially in bigger games, with that offense, receiver core, and defense, it's basically all he'd have to do as long as the O-line pans out and improves. Do you think that turnovers will be an issue? Not can, but will they be an issue?
I don't think so. I think Chip and Ryan are too good at coaches to allow that to happen. I think they're going to tell Will, look, you have all of these guys around you. Get the ball in their hands. Don't make risky plays. I don't see him throwing too many interceptions. I don't think he's going to be put in many situations where he has to make such tight throws where it's going to be, possibility of an interception. Now, could I be wrong on that? And he goes rogue in some big games and the lights are too bright? Yeah, absolutely. But I think they're going to run the ball really well. He's going to get the ball to Emeka Ibuka, Carnell Tate, all these guys on slants, some really creative play calls from Chip. That would be the only reason why this team isn't able to reach their full potential. But I think, again, Ryan and Chip are too good at coaches to allow that to happen.
Yeah, they're some of the best schemers in the country, and now they're working for the same team.
I said I didn't think Chip was going to leave UCLA. I called it on my Instagram. I said there's no shot this dude leaves a head coaching job. And I think within 48 hours he left. And one of my buddies that runs one of those big Ohio State pages, he screenshotted it and he said, "Hey, James, what's this?" I was like, "Yeah, I was wrong. I'll take that on the chin." I didn't think it was going to happen, but hey, it happened. So
it's understandable, but in hindsight, because I looked at UCLA's roster after last year, and especially with the way that Kelly's an offensive guy, and their offense last year was bad. It was super inefficient for all the talent they had on the O-line, receiver, tight end, QB, running back. Their offense should have been top 15, top 10. It wasn't even like top 50. That's how bad their offense was last year. And then losing Lynn, losing much of their defense and offense, I thought from the get-go that UCLA this year would be bad, like terrible, even with Kelly. And I think he saw that too and wanted out. But I didn't think that was going to happen. That shocked me when I heard, wow, he's really going to leave a head coaching job to go to Ohio State. Chip Kelly's scheme is known to help the offensive line do its job better because of all the different options to different players to run the ball and the speed. And also recently, he's used a lot of tight ends, and recently he's done well at offensive line development as well. I mean, at UCLA, that was his calling card, was run and then using the tight ends. Ohio State loses Cade Stover, and last year their offensive line was disappointing to say the least. Where do you see those two groups improving, or will they?
Yeah, I do think Ohio State's offensive line play is going to improve. Donovan Jackson's back. I mean, I'm not going to list all those guys again, but they have a room of, we've heard Ryan Day say, with Big Ten Media Days, they've got a group of 6, 7 guys they feel pretty confident about. And if someone's not playing up to the standard they need to be, they have no problem with sitting them down and having the next man up. Now, the tight end room, I'm pretty concerned about. I know that G. Scott is still there, a former wide receiver that turned tight end, put some weight on. Great route runner, great pass catcher, but is he going to be able to improve in his run blocking? Because like you just said, Chip Kelly loves to run the football. You think about the teams he had at Oregon with LaMichael James and Kenyon Barner, D'Anthony Thomas. They had tight ends that were willing to block, get their nose in there, and create gaps for those running backs. I know they got a transfer from Ohio University. I think Jelani Thurman is going into his sophomore year. But it's a lot of raw talent and a lot of guys that, traditionally, I mean, think about when they had Jeremy Rucker, Luke Farrell, all of these guys that were NFL players. I don't see that right now in their tight end room.
Yeah, that's really the read I have, minus one thing. I think their pass blocking will improve, bringing back their tackles and having better depth there. And I also think Will Kakmarek, their tight end coming in from Ohio, he's known as a blocking tight end. Run blocking is really where that line was terrible last year. Even with Donovan Jackson and Matthew Jones, both their guards returned, and their run blocking was that bad. And without Henderson, it was pretty clear. With Henderson, it was difficult to tell by the stat sheet, but when you watched games, even against Michigan State, they were getting pushed around and run blocking, but Henderson was just so fast that it didn't matter. He could just find a hole and just in that brief moment execute and dart forward. I wonder with McLaughlin, McLaughlin was good enough to transfer to Ohio State, but he struggled mightily last year. And with there being a new guard, I wonder how good their O-line will be in general, but more so at run blocking. But I also have a thought that says it doesn't really matter because of the talent they have at running back and the way they may be able to scheme out some of those holes and make the O-line look better than it is.
Yeah, going back to what you said, like last year, their run blocking was not very good at all. But I think back to 2 specific plays. One against Notre Dame, where I think it was Leofow, their linebacker. He gave up the wrong shoulder, and that allowed Henderson to cut outside, and he went for a 60-yard touchdown. And then another play at Wisconsin at night, where it was the same type of deal. They gave up outside leverage, and Henderson was off to the races. Even if their offensive line improves 15, 20%, having Henderson's ability to do that, and now Quinshon Judkins, who, not that Travion's not a physical runner, he's not a big guy, but he's not afraid of contact. Quinshon and his ability to break tackles and, throw off those second and third layer guys, That's all they have to do. They just have to get 15, 20% better on that offensive line, and things are really going to open up for them.
Yeah, that's a scary thought because Judkins will just plow through people, and then once they're worn down, the opponent, Henderson, will open them up. He's like
Yeah.
a can opener, and that defense will be screeching in pain. Do you think that there's any other team not named Oregon who could overthrow Ohio State this year?
Right now, I don't think so. Now
Interesting.
that could obviously change. Depending on how Michigan looks against Texas, we're gonna know a lot. Texas lost their two stud defensive tackles in Sweat and Murphy. So if Michigan's offensive line is able to gel really well that first game against Fresno State, and we see them dominate Texas in the trenches, possibly Penn State. I have to see them put it all together. I know they're going on year 3 of that great recruiting class with Carter and Allen, Singleton, Aller. Um, but I have to see it. I have to see it in the first couple of games. Those, Penn State and Michigan really play well. But as of right now, I don't think anybody besides Oregon could knock them off.
Interesting. And I say that because I look at Michigan and Penn State, and while I view Ohio State as the best team in the Big Ten right now, I think that top four is fairly close together. Ohio State being in the lead, but Oregon and Michigan and Penn State, whatever order you want to put them in between 2, 3, and 4, are trailing pretty close behind Ohio State. And with Penn State, it's James Franklin, so I can't pick him to beat Ohio State. And with Michigan, there's just so much that's new, and it's a road game. I just have a feeling that looking at Penn State and Michigan roster-wise, especially in the trenches, that if Ohio State doesn't play their cards right or play to their strengths, those teams, I think, do overall have a trench advantage matchup. But again, I think Ohio State deserves to be preseason number 1. I'm picking them to win the Big Ten. But I think the Big Ten in that top-heavy 4-team area will be pretty competitive.
I would say Penn State, like you said, James Franklin. The dude, what is he? 1-9 against Ohio State now. 1-8.
Yep, 1-9 against Ohio State, and he's never beaten a top 10 Michigan team. Like, he actually can't. Josh Pate would say he hasn't, not that he can't, but at some point when you're so consistent at something, that's kind of like just the rightful expectation.
Yeah, and it's not a talent thing. I mean, they have talented players every single year. They recruit so well, and they get them at home this year. Penn State's schedule, I know we're talking about Ohio State here, but Penn State's schedule this year, they don't have Oregon. They don't have Michigan. I know they have to go to USC, but I'm not very high on USC this year. I think they have to go to Wisconsin.
Yep.
And they get the Buckeyes at home. And all those guys going into their third year that are so talented, some of them are going to go to the NFL draft next year. Abdul Carter, in my opinion, is one of the best defensive players in college football. I mean, just what's the excuse? I mean, are Penn State fans just going to be okay with this? Year after year after year losing this game? Because they've come close,
Yeah, I feel the pent-up anger, especially last year after that Michigan game. That's why Yursich was fired the morning after. Not just because it's another performance, but the fans were booing the team, the players. It was toxic all over social media. And, I mean, to a certain degree, it's just a game, but that performance was awful. I mean, Michigan, their run-blocking O-line wasn't nearly as good as the prior 2 years, and then they ran for 5 yards per carry against the number 1 run defense. It was a microcosm, to a certain degree, of 2022 all over again. Just without the 50 and 60-yard runs, or there was even the 3rd and long conversion run by Edwards, where he had a touchdown against Penn State last year on a 3rd and long, And then late in the fourth quarter in 22, they just ran it to chew clock and he converted it. And I think they got a touchdown out of it.
Yep.
But let's actually move on to Penn State, because despite all of those things, Franklin being himself and not in a good way when it comes to top 10 opponents, and this team in big moments, despite all the NFL talent they have, like you said, they just keep coming up short, and there's no excuses for it. But I think that with the easy schedule and with what they bring back, they're second in the former bit. No, that's the wrong way of phrasing it. In the top 4 teams by preseason odds and rankings in the Big Ten, they're second in returning production. They're ahead of Ohio State and Michigan. They're only behind Oregon. And Oregon's only number 1 because of transfers. So you take out transfers, Penn State in that category would be number 1. And that's important for team cohesion, and you never exactly know how transfers will pan out. I think that this is the year, whether in the regular season against Ohio State or in the postseason, because I think they'll make the college football playoff, they'll beat a good team. They'll beat a top 10 team in a legitimate setting, in a legitimate chasing the national championship moment. Not like they did against Utah in the Rose Bowl, which that was the season's end no matter what. Or not. When was the last time they beat a top 10 team before then? It's so long ago. It was Wisconsin in 2016. But I think they'll get it done this year because of number 1, Andy Kotelnicki, number 2, Drew Aller in his second year with a better OC, and number 3, actually, this reason's probably the most important besides Kotelnicki, what they have on their defensive front. They lost guys, but then they reshuffled them, and they had so much depth there last year that I think they'll be nearly as good, if not the same.
Yeah, I think, their defensive line, the problem they've had in the last couple of years is that their defensive tackles haven't been, big enough guys to withstand an entire game and stop the run. Now, I don't have the depth chart in front of me, but I've looked at it a lot. They've got 4 or 5 guys that have been there for a long time that have gotten bigger and stronger. Their defensive tackles are going to be better. And I know they lost Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac, but Denise Sutton, that kid's ceiling is he could be a first-round pick. And then taking Abdul Carter and moving him down to edge, he might be, we might be seeing a Micah Parsons 2.0. And I know that's a big comparison, but that kid's ceiling's super high.
It's realistic.
This defensive line is going to be insane.
Yeah, they have 3 out of the 5 guys you mentioned who are all seniors, which means next year you wonder what'll happen next year. But they're all, actually, Zane Durant's a junior, but 4 out of the 5 that you brought up are seniors, and 3 of them weigh over 300 pounds, and they're all like 6'2", 6'3", so they're sized now. And then Carter will be an All-American at edge. Dennis Sutton has that potential. And then Zariah Fisher and Amin Vanover, their backups at the 2 edge positions, they're seniors too. So this unit is veteran-laden. And on the offensive side, they have multiple seniors and juniors, and they've recruited well there. They've out-recruited Michigan and Ohio State by a long shot on the offensive line over the past 4 cycles. So I wasn't impressed with Phil Trautwein and the job that he did at first, but every year their offensive line's gotten bigger, more physical, and better. So I really think that in spite of Franklin, that this is the year. And I could be wrong on that. And I don't have them beating Ohio State. But what I'm implying is, especially with Kotelnicki's system and the fact that they have some younger, unproven talent at receiver and at secondary, I think they'll get better as the year goes on, especially with their easy schedule and the fact that Franklin before has rested players at the end of the regular season like they do in the NFL. He did that one year against Rutgers, and I think he's done it some other years too. That's a very NFL-esque strategy. And especially with the 12-team playoff, that could pay dividends. And I think that an 11-1 Penn State team gets a home playoff game. They'll host what is probably a top 10 team. And I think either there or against an Ohio State team that I think they match up very well with for their defensive line to Ohio State's O-line, I think they get it done. Do you disagree with me on that? It's understandable if you do. It's bold to pick Franklin to win anything of significance.
I have them going 11-1, and their only loss being Ohio State. I have Oregon going 12-0 and then losing to Ohio State in the Big Ten championship. But yeah, I think Penn State's going to make the college football playoff. I think they're going to host a playoff game just like you, and I'm right on the same page as you. I think this could be the year, not in the sense of winning the Big Ten, but finally doing something significant and winning a playoff game. I think they have a great opportunity to. I think they're going to win a playoff game. If they get seeded 7th or 8th and they host, the 12th or 11th best team or whatever. It's all going to come down to Drew Aller. I hope, looking at the film last year, I've watched cut-ups of that Ohio State game probably half a dozen times now. I don't know what was going on. I don't know if it was coaching or they changed, a lot of plays in their playbook. But Aller just seemed off that entire game.
Their game plan sucked. They passed 43 times and only ran it like 20. If they did the reverse, they may have won. In retrospect, with how, if you consistently ran on Ohio State's D-line, it was good, but because they played in wide technique, if you consistently ran on them, you could get, in field goal range and just take what you could get. I have no clue why they passed 43 times against what ended up being the nation's best secondary, at least in rating allowed and completion percentage. It was awful. Made
no sense to me. And they had two great offensive tackles that are now gone, Fashanu and Wallace. It was lean on those guys. Use Singleton and Allen, get 4 or 5 yards. They're playing wide technique. You have these gaps are open. It didn't make any sense. It was a total lack in competent coaching. I did not understand that game plan at all.
Yeah, it was what are you doing? And then when they passed on 3rd and 1, which really you should QB sneak it with Aller, but even then, Lambert Smith beat his guy, and that was a touchdown if they got it, and Aller just threw it way behind him. So his development was off, coaching was off. Outside of coaching, because with coaching, especially with Franklin, and coaches that have been there a while. It's the same thing with Ferentz. I don't want to continue to mention Franklin because he's done a good job for a lot of things. But with Ferentz, for example, Iowa will never have a top 10 offense. You just know things. It's same with Harbaugh. You're never going to have a top 5 or top 10 recruiting class. And your offense is never going to light up the scoreboard even if it can. Outside of coaching, what does Penn State need to do to beat Ohio State? Because if they beat Ohio State, they're definitely going 11-1 or 12-0. And if they beat the Buckeyes, you're not just talking about a team that can win the Big Ten. You're talking about now a team that can win it all if they beat Ohio State.
Yeah, I know. So Keandre Lambert-Smith transfers out. I think he went to Auburn. They're able to bring Julian Fleming in from Ohio State. A kid that they recruited really hard and were very disappointed when he didn't choose them. I know Caden Saunders is back. Clifford's little brother is still there. So they have a solid receiving core. Now, Theo Johnson's gone. I'm blanking on the other tight end they had a couple years ago, but he's gone. They have Nate Warren, I believe is his name, big tight end, number 44, big target. Drew Aller's got to take that next step. I mean, he's a big kid, 6'5", 240. Some people have used a comp of, him becoming the next Josh Allen. I don't see that. I think Allen is way, way more mobile. But if Aller can improve and sit in the pocket better, make better reads, because for some reason, I think it might be coaching, he always looks like he's in a rush in big games. And I don't know if that's a lack of confidence in his offensive line and he doesn't think he's getting the protection he needs, but he never really sets his feet. And now with them losing Fashanu and Wallace, he's going to have to put that trust into two new guys, blocking out there for his blind side. So, yeah, Aller's got to settle in. He's got to mature, and he's going into his junior year now. He's an upperclassman. If Aller can play at a first round draft pick level, which so many mock drafts have him going in the first round.
Really? Still?
A lot. Yeah. Surprise. Yeah, I don't get it either, but we got to see it first. But if Aller's able to improve about 25%, this Penn State team is going to be really, really good.
Yeah, it really is. In terms of unlocking their ceiling, it is in his hands, because I think even with what they lose at secondary, they'll be good there. We already talked about the defensive front. They should, once again, I would say, come close to leading the nation, or perhaps lead the nation in sacks. They'll probably lead the Big Ten in that category, given what they had last year, what they bring back. And on offense, their offensive line, while probably not elite, they return enough. Nick Dawkins, their last year's backup center, projected to start this year. He's a senior. They have Sal Wormley coming back, and J.B. Nelson. They should be good on the interior. And Warren's one of the nation's best tight ends. So it's really all about, can Julian Fleming stay healthy? Can Caden Saunders step up? And can Aller step up? And can Singleton hit those holes? Because he couldn't do that last year. He had a very almost Donovan Edwards-like season last year, where both him and Singleton struggled to find open holes in space to score. The team we haven't talked about yet is Oregon. Oregon's interesting to me. Do you think that this is a hot take or not? Oregon can be anywhere from the best team in the Big Ten by a significant margin to being clearly fourth. Like, they have that range.
I think that's a hot take. I would say that's a hot take. But I understand where you're coming from, because the last couple of years with Lanning, I get it was year 1 and 2. They had very high expectations, and the one hump they weren't able to get over was Washington, 0-3 against the Huskies. Their offense, I said earlier in the show, I think Michigan could have the best defense in the country. I think Oregon could have the best offense by a significant margin. Dylan Gabriel at Oklahoma, he was good, but I think I was listening to Joel Klatt. I was listening to somebody the other day, and they're talking about the design of the Sooners offense, where they go vertical so often with Nick Anderson and Andrell Anthony, who ended up getting hurt. But Oregon, they're more focused on what can you do in the slot, slant routes, out routes, those types of things. And with Tej Johnson, Evan Stewart coming over from Texas A&M, these fast receivers that are able to make quick cuts, that's going to be really, really good for Dylan Gabriel. Like you said, Jordan James at running back. I like their tight end room a lot. Terrence Ferguson, Patrick Herbert, two really big tight ends, 6'6 plus, 250 plus. I think they have the best offensive tackle duo in Cornelius and Connerly. My only question mark for Oregon's offense is the interior of the offensive line. And looking at their depth chart, I think it's going to be a solid group in there too. So
yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, when you lose Jackson Powers Johnson, that's always going to hurt. But Epani Lalolu, I hope that's how you pronounce his name, he played as a true freshman a lot last year. Sophomore now, projected to start at center. And then Marcus Harper, the second, Matthew Bedford, the Indiana transfer, are going to make up still a stout interior.
Yeah.
Defensively, that's the only reason why I think that this team could be worse than the former Big Three is, they got Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon in the portal, and Jordan Birch comes back, and Mateo Uiagalelei was highly recruited. I get that. Jeffrey Bassa and Justin Jacobs should make up a solid linebacker core. And they do bring back Jalil Florence, and they bring in Jabbar Muhammad from the portal. So I understand the sentiment that Oregon's defense could be one of the best in the country. But I also look at how, in facing a pretty easy schedule last year, sportsrankings.com had it, or sportsreference.com had it outside of the top 30, well outside the top 30. ESPN did not have it anywhere close to the top 10. The defense against Washington would completely flail out for 3 quarters. And that's not a big sample size. So there's not a lot of evidence to say their defense will be bad. I don't think it will be bad. But I just wonder how they're going to, like, is there a chance that this defense can come in and be good, but then when it comes time to put the lock on and to control the game and to stop the bleeding, like, will they be able to shut down Ohio State's run game? Or will they be able to shut down Michigan's? Or Wisconsin? Wisconsin's going to have an awesome O-line, and they have a deep running back room even after losing Braylon Allen. That's really where my question stands. Is that understandable, or is the body of work and incoming players such that they're almost a lock to have one of the nation's better defenses?
I really like Oregon's front 7, front 6, but I have a lot of question marks about their secondary. Now, like you said, Jabbar Muhammad came in from Washington, and Kobe Savage, I believe that's his name, the safety transfer from K-State, is a very, very talented player. But if their offense in those games against Ohio State and Michigan, if the offense isn't able to stay on the field and sustain drives, it's very similar to Michigan, in my opinion, where they have a lot of studs. I'm very high on Bassa and Jacobs. I think that could be the best linebacking duo in the country.
Wow.
But the depth is a concern. And if they're playing Ohio State and they're having 3 and outs and they're not able to sustain drives, Ohio State could start wearing down that defense. Michigan could start wearing down that defense, and that's where things can get ugly. So,
yeah, the biggest concern for me with their defense is pass rush. That's really what it is.
yep.
I think that defensive tackle core right now is better than that defensive end unit. And if they can't get pressure, and they struggled against Washington last year, and the year prior to that, they couldn't get pressure on anyone. I mean, they couldn't. And if it really depends, because if Ohio State's O-line isn't that good for what Ohio State's O-line should be, then that's probably not a huge issue. Or if Michigan's O-line is just average or above average or good but not great, then that won't be an issue either. And Wisconsin doesn't have the type of talent everywhere to where even if there is some matchup problems, Oregon should be able to wear them down. It's not a given, and upsets happen. That's an upset that actually I look at and think, well, I might predict that. But Oregon should beat them. They should be favored 9 times out of 10, unless Wisconsin somehow does something miraculous and Oregon completely tanks. I really like your take, even though I disagree with it about Bassa and Jacobs, because I look at Oregon and I can't find any true, quote-unquote, weakness. I can find weak spots, weak links, areas where, well, this part of the roster is not as good as, let's say, the receiver core or the offensive tackle unit, but there truly is no bad unit, even in comparison to Ohio State. Like, I think Ohio State's O-line, or more specifically the tight end room, could be just mediocre. I don't see any unit on Oregon that can be anything worse than good. And that's what's scary, is I don't think you see that for any other team in the Big Ten. And that's why I think they have such a high ceiling.
Yeah, I know we've heard so much about Ohio State and all the guys they brought back. Oregon brings back a lot of guys that had a lot of snaps last year. And I think, obviously, they have a lot of talent, but the team chemistry that they have, that's going to be a big factor in how successful they're going to be this year.
Yeah, and they've developed well there. They've recruited well. They even used the portal selectively, and Bedford was good at Indiana.
Yep.
I think this will once again be one of the nation's best offensive lines, especially at pass blocking. And how about this too? It's Dylan Gabriel and Miller Moss and not really anyone else for quarterbacks who actually have like a Heisman All-American caliber ceiling. The Big Ten is weak at quarterback. It didn't even matter that we added the four Pac-12 schools. They're still terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, Will Howard has a limited ceiling. We don't even know what Orgy's capable of outside of the ground game. Tyler Van Dyke has struggled. Dylan Raiola and Aiden Childs and maybe Aller probably have the highest ceilings outside of Miller Moss and Dylan Gabriel. But Childs is unproven for the most part. I'm very high on him, but that's watching selective film, liking Oregon State last year, and you just don't know how he'll do at a new school. Raiola's a freshman, and Aller stunk last year. So that quarterback advantage is big. I guess what stops me from picking them to win it all or be the top team in the Big Ten or even top two is just that defense. I need to see how Lupoi does with that unit, especially against teams that know how to scheme, before I can pick them to be the Big Ten's most consistent or second most consistent team.
I think a big reason I'm so high on Oregon is because, like you were talking about, the quarterbacks, I think Dylan Gabriel is head and shoulders way better than anybody else in the Big Ten. And it's kind of weird how, things flipped. Last year you had Caleb Williams, Bo Nix, Michael Penix, J.J. McCarthy. Look at the SEC. They have 5 teams that return their quarterback that started a New Year's Six Bowl last year. Texas with Ewers, Ole Miss with Dart, Cook at Missouri, Milroe at Bama, and Beck at Georgia. Like, the script is completely flipped where now it's the SEC that's quarterback dominant. But, I mean, Miller Moss, a guy, I watched some more film of him. He had a great game against Louisville. Now, does Louisville have the best secondary, the best defense in college football? No, absolutely not. He was throwing it with a lot of confidence. He's going to be a really good player. So I like what you're talking about with Gabriel and Moss really being the 1 and 2 best quarterbacks, and then it's a big drop-off.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch for sure. But we're getting closer, and Big Ten Media Days is kind of a sneak peek of that. I'm trying to not buy in as much to what coaches and players say at Media Days compared to last year, because that's an easy way to drink the Kool-Aid. And they're all mostly going to say some positive things, but you can always have a few takeaways or responses here and there. Did you catch what Brett Bielema said? He was the first coach to talk on day one.
I did not know.
It was so interesting hearing him talk, because while he wasn't specifically talking about like this year's team outside of when he was asked questions, and he talked about Xavier Scott and the secondary and the defense being much better than it was last year. He talked a lot about the portal and the new era of college football. And he seemed, especially for someone who was a head coach at Wisconsin for over a decade ago, or was the head coach of Wisconsin over a decade ago, back in 2010, 11, even 09, 08. I think 06 was his first year. Almost 2 decades ago was when he was first head coach at Wisconsin. He seemed excited for changes. And they made a lot of transfer portal additions late, and it's better to make them early, but they brought in Terrence Brooks from Texas, and they brought in a lot of really highly graded offensive linemen from lower levels of football to add to an offense that was not good last year. They returned Pat Bryant, and not necessarily for this year, but I'm thinking to myself, is Brett Bielema, is this almost implying that he's going to stick around unless he's fired, and that because he's excited about changes and looks like he wants to stay at Illinois, is he going to be around for a while? And Illinois is just going to be that team who hangs around and maybe pops out for a year.
I think Bielema loves football way too much to walk away right now. I see him coaching for another 5-10 years unless he's fired, like you just brought up. Illinois' 2022 team, I feel like that was one of the biggest missed opportunities I've seen recently. That team was so stacked. Witherspoon, Sidney Brown, Chase Brown, the amount of their defensive tackles that they had, Randolph and Newton, that team was so good. And I think they started, I could be wrong on this, but it was like 7-1 or 6-1, something
It
like
was
that.
7-1, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they blew that game at home to Michigan State, which was really bizarre. They lost another game, and they came into the big house 7-3, almost beat Michigan, dropped to 7-4. That was just such a weird year because it started out and it was like, oh, Bielema's going to do at Wisconsin do at Illinois what he did at Wisconsin. And then things just unraveled so quick. And then last year, I remember that Kansas game. I think I put like $20 or something on Illinois, and it gets to halftime, and Kansas is just and I'm looking at the TV, and I'm like, what is happening? Is this Brett Bielema's team? Like, did they walk out like a D2 school? Didn't make any sense. So, yeah, this year I'm excited to see what Bielema does. I like Illinois a lot. I've always just liked their uniforms, their tradition. So I'm rooting for him. But yeah, I don't see Bielema walking away anytime soon.
I want to like them, like just their team this year, because they bring back a lot, and Bielema always, whether it was 2022 or more so 2021, he always finds a way to either get in close games that shouldn't be close, or to win like close games over a team that's better than his, or at least at the time is ranked ahead of his. And in 2022, yeah, the way they dominated Minnesota, the way they destroyed Wisconsin in their own house, and how close they played Michigan, it was a clear indication of this is a good team. I just think that really it's their talent, it's the Big Ten West, and even if you develop well or have a good defense, at the end of the day, I've heard before the phrase defense is a choice, but offense requires like at least a mass base pool of talent to be elite at. I don't know if that's true, but if that theory is correct, it explains like Iowa or Illinois, like outside of some issues that Iowa's had at OC, they can coach up their defense, but when you have Tommy DeVito at quarterback and an offensive line that isn't like Michigan's or Ohio State's was in 2022, or even like Penn State's, even when you have Chase Brown, you're going to run into some issues. But I like him this year. I don't know if I'm going to pick him to go bowling. Right now, I don't. And my Big Ten predictions are pretty set. By the way, if y'all want to watch that video, I imagine all of you have, because it's going to get probably 20,000 views before the season starts. But if you click on my channel link, it's the first thing that comes up. Like it's posted up there. So check that out. I think I have them at 5-7, and I think next year they'll do very well because they're a fairly young team. And if they have a big year this year and go bowling, watch out for them to actually be like a top 25 team the following year. But yeah, I agree with you. 2022 was such a missed opportunity. Very missed. And going back to Ohio State a little bit, and actually speaking of 2022 in the offensive line, that unit with Luke Whippler was really good. And last year was a disappointment, but Day said at media days that he, like you mentioned, he likes this offensive line. They have plenty of guys also at the two deep that they feel like they can trust. And he even said that you'll see the improvements physically in some of the open practices they have in the next few weeks. What do you make of his confidence there? You think any of it's misguided, or do you think it's legit and this O-line is going to push people over?
I think it's legit confidence. I don't know if they're going to bully people per se. I think they're going to improve a lot. We've seen how personal Ryan Day's taken the comments that his team isn't physical enough. They need to run the ball better. Urban Meyer has preached. Now, Ryan Day with C.J. Stroud and Justin Fields and all the receivers they've had, their passing game's been unmatched, against any other college football program. But Urban Meyer, he talks so often about having a running quarterback. and how that adds another man for the defense to be accountable for and how that opens up so many different things. With Ryan Day's offense, obviously they don't do that. And I feel like not having a running quarterback kind of, if not forces, I'm trying to find the right word for it, but it makes the offensive line not softer, but it's like,
It
okay,
hides the issues.
yeah, perfectly. Yeah. So I think it's a good confidence from Ryan Day. I like their offensive line. I like the depth. I like what they brought in the portal. Are they going to bully people? I don't think so. But Judkins, he's going to be able to get those 4 or 5 yards on first down. Travion Henderson's still going to be able to make his explosive runs. So it'll definitely be an improved unit. And their overall confidence as a team, I thought they were a little hubristic. Now I get why, because they have X amount of guys that could have went in the first, second round last year and came back, but they might need to. And we heard them talking about we came back because we want to set a gold pants, we want to beat Michigan. That's cool. They're not pounding their chest and saying we're going to do it, but they might need to calm down a little bit before maybe they talk themselves into something.
Yeah, I did get that feeling a little bit. Now, granted, Michigan spoke openly of their goals in 21, 22, and 23. I didn't really have a problem with that exactly. I almost look at the hubris more not from media days, and I could be wrong here, but more from the standpoint that in the 2022 game against Michigan, Ohio State thought they were going to blow Michigan out, and then the reason they lost is because they had a meltdown over the fact that that game was close. That's what the G. Scott penalty was, is I can't believe you're playing me close, so I'm going to throw the controller across the room. And then last year, they had not the exact same thing, but I think there was a similar confidence that we're going to come in here and show these guys that we're better than them, and their success was fluky, and that just didn't happen. But they should improve on the O-line, and they should beat Michigan this year. And I'm not going to not pick them to do that, because it's Ryan Day, who's a top 5 coach in my opinion, and they easily have a top 3 talent roster and a coaching staff to make that roster into something that can execute well on any given Saturday. What opinion provided by these coaches is bolder? Kirk Ferentz said that he thinks Iowa has the potential to have a good offense. And Rutgers head coach Greg Schiano said that he thinks this team basically is loaded with NFL talent.
I think, I haven't looked at Rutgers depth chart, to be completely honest with you, but I would have to say Schiano's. I like Iowa's offense. I think they're going to be a lot better this year, but wow, I didn't know Schiano said that. That's a pretty bold thing to say.
He alluded to that. That's what I took away from it. Maybe
Okay.
I misinterpreted it, but I'm pretty sure he said like they have several NFL players on that roster.
I mean, I love their running back. I think Kyle Monunga is one of the best running backs in the country. But other than that, I don't know if Lego is still there, their tight end. But I couldn't really name too many guys on that side of the ball. Now, granted, that team is always scrappy. Schiano's a very, physical coach. His teams are always very physical. It's all about being together and the culture. So I don't know. Maybe, yeah, that could happen. But I definitely have to take a look at their roster.
Yeah, I think the Iowa one's bolder, solely because their receiver core is terrible. And I hope I'm wrong there. Like, I hope that Caleb Brown or Jacob Gill come out of nowhere and just are good. And I think that with Cade there, they return almost all of their offensive linemen. They have a deep stable of running backs, and tight end with Estrenga and Lachey is going to be good. They'll probably be a top 90, top 80, maybe top 70 offense. And if they perform at that level, their defense should be the best in the country based off of what they return and the fact that Phil Parker's their DC. And consequentially, they'll probably beat everyone, or at least compete with everyone except for Ohio State in the regular season because their schedule's easy.
Yeah.
But with Rutgers, their O-line grades out as one of the better Big Ten O-lines entering this year. They return a ton. They're exceptional in run blocking. Monungai's good. Christian Dremel is, I wouldn't say an NFL wide receiver, but he's certainly underrated, and Wimsatt didn't help him show his case last year. And Kaliak Manis probably won't either this year. And then defensively, they have Aaron Lewis, Flip Dixon, Robert Longerbeam, that defensive lineman and two defensive backs, respectively. But Mohamed Toure and Powell at linebacker are the really intriguing case. I think I still have to look at the linebacker cores for the other conferences. And by the way, for those of you looking, I'm going to have like a whole All-American selection and other stuff coming out for August, which will be a huge month. I wouldn't be shocked if Rutgers had the best linebacker starting duo in the country. I mean, they're really good. And if I'm wrong, and if you're right, which there's a big chance of that happening, some people may not notice that because Rutgers' schedule is so easy. They don't play Ohio State, they don't play Michigan, they don't play Oregon, they don't even play Penn State. Their toughest game will be either at USC, at Nebraska, could even be at Virginia Tech. That could be their toughest game, is going down to Blacksburg against a team that hasn't been good in nearly a decade since Beamer was there. It's crazy. Like they're going, talk about stat padding. That team could look much more impressive than they actually are. But what do you like about Iowa's offense? I'm curious on that one, actually.
I like their offensive line. If Cade can stay healthy and play the way he did in that 2021 season for Michigan, just be a system quarterback, get the ball where it needs to be on time. Now, like you said, their receiving room isn't very good, but I like their running backs. Caleb Johnson, who isn't even depending on where you look at their depth chart, isn't even the starter right now. I think he's a top 15 running back in college football. I really like what he has on tape. I think they're going to have a really good running game. The fact that Kirk's son is no longer there, the nepotism is done with. I feel like they're going to improve a lot, and their schedule's not too hard. They have to go to Ohio State. They don't play Michigan. I don't think they play Penn State. I don't think they play Oregon.
Nope, they don't. Only Ohio State.
Yeah, so I mean, Iowa, they could be a 10-win team this year. Just if their offense improves, I don't know point-wise if they were top 100 last year or whatever, but if they're able to improve by 20, 30 spots, 10-2 is a very, very reasonable record for them.
Do you think that if Ohio State looks ahead too much to Oregon and Iowa does have a good offense, do you think there's any chance that, like, just even a 0.1% chance that we could see something happen there? And that's not even my prediction. That's just me asking a question.
I've looked at that game a lot, and I love Iowa's defense. I love Phil Parker and his philosophy on defense. A lot of the time they sit back in that too high shell and they just let you make mistakes and they capitalize off of it. I don't think I was going to go in there and win. I don't think there's even like a slim chance of that happening. Now, I think it's going to be a lot closer than, 2 years ago when they went in there and their offense turned the ball over what seemed to be 87 times. But I think they could go in there and they could challenge them. They could, cause some concern for the Buckeye faithful in a 30-14 game, a 27-17 game. I wouldn't be shocked if it was a close game, but I can't see them winning that.
Yeah, understandable. I can't either. I do see the challenging portion, but the winning one, no, not really. Potentially more on that really though, depending on how they look. But I've now gained a reputation based off of my playoff video and my Iowa video. I'm picking them to reach the playoff with an 11-1 record. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I think they're losing to Ohio State, but they're probably going to beat everyone else. And I originally had them going, I think 8-4, 9-3, but then they got Sullivan in the portal, a few other guys, other programs lost some, and I looked at their depth chart with a magnifying glass, and I'm thinking, gosh, like they're really good at winning one-score games, and they return that entire defense and should have a better offense with Lester. Imagine Iowa if they they know how to win one-score games. What happens when they build like two-score leads with that defense? Most offenses won't be able to overcome that, even if it's Iowa trying to hold on for that lead for 30 minutes. And then
Yeah,
finally, or do you have something to say?
I was just going to add to that because most of the time, like, Iowa sits back in their base defense and allows you to make mistakes. And if their offense is able to get them up by 2 possessions and force the opposition to take riskier plays, that could start a snowball effect and games could get out of hand really quick. So,
Yeah, I think you're going to see that happening a lot. And I would look for whether it's Wisconsin or Nebraska. Those will be teams that I think will be pretty good on offense, but they have some question marks. They're home games in Iowa, and I think those games will be like Wisconsin Notre Dame from a few years back, where when Notre Dame took the fourth quarter lead, it just got totally out of control.
that's a great way to
It's
put it.
probably what Iowa will do to some of the more competent teams they face that aren't Ohio State, but like the next tier or two below is they'll just begin to force them into errors. And then finally, UCLA and USC, the two schools from LA. Deshaun Foster and Lincoln Riley both spoke today. And it was interesting listening to them because on one hand, Deshaun Foster basically got up to the podium and had one of the worst opening press conferences that I could have ever watched. You could tell that he was excited. You could tell that he was overwhelmed, and I can't blame him. He went from being a running backs coach who was really good at his job to probably the most unproven head coach in the country. And Chip Kelly didn't leave him in a good spot. He just didn't. I mean, even before Foster was the head coach, I thought this team was going to be bad. And now they have a brand new head coach with a staff that I also look at the staff. And a lot of these staffers are from the FCS or non-Division I football. Like even Bieniemy, he hasn't been in college football in a while. So it's interesting. And people look at that and they say, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing. And there may be some truth to that, but I don't know. But then you look at Lincoln Riley and USC and the fact that Riley, if he really has been in on this transitioning to the Big Ten for as long as USC has been, he's probably known almost since he got there that was going to be the plan, or that was in the works to a certain degree, if he had that communication with his AD. You look at him retaining Grinch, that's a I don't know what I'm doing move. And you look entering this year, and despite all the confidence that I heard from him at media days, they have questions on the O-line, and D'Anton Lynn, he's a miracle worker. He's a top 10 DC in the country. UCLA losing him hurt, but Jim Knowles is a top 5 defensive coordinator, I think, in the country, and he couldn't take Ohio State's defense to top 10 in year one. They were good, great for much of the year, but against offenses that were physical and that could create big plays, his defense fell apart. USC wasn't even top 100 in almost any category last year, except for maybe sacks and turnovers forced. How high... Let me rephrase that question. What are UCLA and USC going to do in the Big Ten long term? Will they succeed? Will they fail? Will they be mediocre?
I think UCLA is in a horrible spot right now. It's going to take a lot of time for them to get back to a respectable program. Since Kelly left and Dante Moore transferred to Oregon, I kind of threw them in the pit of despair, and I haven't even looked at their depth chart in probably a month or two. USC, I am not very high on at all, and I made a post on Instagram a little while back, and I just started a YouTube channel. And one of the videos I did was a preview on them. It was just a short 10-minute video, and I had a couple fans say, "This guy has no idea what he's talking about." Like, you're gonna, buddy's gonna find out really soon, because I don't think USC is gonna be very good this year. Now, like I said, I watched some Miller Moss tape, and he had a really good game against Louisville, but that's not a great defense. Um, I think with what Lincoln Riley was hired to do, the expectation was he wasn't going to get them back to a Pete Carroll level, but he was going to make them a top 10 team every year. And last year, how they looked with having the best player in all of college football, it was a shocker and it was really disappointing. Now you lose Caleb Williams, you have Miller Moss coming in, you still have some skilled players. Zachariah Branch is a great receiver. Bear Alexander is a great defensive lineman. But with their schedule, I think, the one thing that really riled up USC fans was that I said I think LSU is going to blow them out in that game at Allegiant Stadium in Vegas.
Ooh.
Yeah, I think LSU is going to win that game by 17, 20 points. I think they're going to lose to Michigan. I know they play Penn State. I think Penn State's going to beat them. I see USC going 8-4, maybe even 7-5 this year.
That's hilarious. The reason why it's hilarious is, and to my credit, or no, to your credit, you may have done more research on LSU than even I have. So I don't know. This opinion may change. I picked USC to upset LSU and then lose 5 or 6 games, because I think LSU has questions at running the ball. And I think the key to beating USC, because they brought in some really good secondary players, the key is going to be if you run on them, they won't beat you. Because I don't know what's stopping. I don't know what on their, or who, or what on their defense is stopping the ground game. But I'll have to watch your USC video, because I don't have a read on USC, which is why I'm picking them to not do well. Because for all the other Big Ten teams, I feel like I have some type of read that's like positive in some way, whether for the future or this year. And for USC, I think that next year, if they hold on to Riley, they'll be really good, because year 2 with Lynn, I think, will produce results. But this year, I could see them going 10-2, and with that schedule, a 10-2 USC, like 95% sure gets in the playoff.
Yep.
But I could also see them going like as bad as 5-7 or 6-6. Like they could be a disaster. They could be one of the best teams in college football. They could, I think, if everything comes together, they could win it all, because their offense, is going to be good, and their defensive staff is now one of the best in the country compared to one of the worst last year. And I agree with you about UCLA. They're not in a good position, and their schedule. I mean, they have LSU in the non-conference, and then they play Oregon, they play Iowa, they have a road trip to Penn State, and I think a road trip to Rutgers too, road trip to Nebraska. A lot of travel time, big non-conference opponent. I feel like you gotta give Deshaun Foster. I almost got him mixed up with D'Anton Lynn, just because both their names start with a D. And both were on UCLA's staff last year. But I think you got to give Foster time to settle in and see if there's just anything encouraging from this year. And then you can probably, like after 2025, you can probably properly assess him and his staff and his roster. Because this year is just, if they somehow go bowling or 7-5, he should get Coach of the Year. Or he should at least be like a contender for Coach of the Year. Because there would be a ranked upset win there somewhere if they achieve that record.
Yeah, it's just about keeping their head above water. They got to get that thing rebuilt. They don't even have a foundation right now. So, yeah, it's a tough job. It's a tough place to be. But I will tell you, I don't know how much you've looked at Michigan State, but that's a team that I think I'm a lot higher on than most. I think Jonathan Smith has an opportunity to possibly go 7-5, 8-4 year 1.
I agree with that. What do you think? before we end it off here, what do you think about Michigan State long term? I know that Smith spoke and he talked about how he doesn't really want to temper expectations. Not like, of course, talk about winning it all this year or next year, but he isn't trying to preach patience in a cautionary way. And he views that this team does have players. What do you think about him long term with a coach as good as Smith?
I think they're going to have a lot of success there with what he was able to do at Oregon State. And I understand the Pac-12 is a lot different than the SEC. It's a lot different than the Big Ten. But they're not able to recruit, even, a good amount of 4-stars. But they were a run-the-ball team. And did they have the success that Harbaugh had at Stanford? No, but it was very similar, where it was, we're just going to smash you in the mouth because we're not going to allow a talent gap on the outside at the skill positions to affect the game as much as it can. Bringing in Vealing, their tight end from Oregon State, Childs, Nathan Carter is back. I know they lost Simeon Burrow to Miami. Derek Harmon went to Oregon. But they still have some guys on their D-line. Their linebacking core is really good. Cal Halliday, Jordan Hall. I think they were able to bring in another couple of transfers. I could see it could go this year specifically. They could start out 4-0. Then they have that brutal stretch. They could lose 4 straight. And then they could win another 4 games to end the year and go 8-4. And I wouldn't be surprised at all. But under Jonathan Smith, I think that's going to be a consistent 8-9 win team.
Yeah. I think that in fact, I think in a few years you'll see them make a run for something, because they were really good the past 2 years at Oregon State. With Childs at quarterback, you wondered that if he just continued to be at Oregon State and build what he had, if they could make a run at something greater than just 10 or 9 wins, which is incredible at Oregon State as is. At Michigan State, you can recruit better. You have way better support. You have more resources, especially next year when you're going to be allowed to directly pay players. And I think Smith's one of the best coaches in the Big Ten, like based off of resume. And he could, depending on what happens in the next 2-3 seasons, he could make a name for himself as being that guy that not only does more with less, but that took Michigan State back to where D'Antonio had them, or just a more modernized version.
Yeah, and I like his phrasing too, low ego, high output, because that's what they had to have at Oregon State. And, like you said, he has more resources at MSU, but is he going to be able to recruit at a Oregon, USC, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State level? No. But he's going to get a lot more 4-stars, and the way he develops players. And I just like him as a person. He just seems like a simple guy that it's show up to work, do your job, do it well. And that's gonna do really well in East Lansing.
Yeah. When the rumors about Harbaugh leaving Michigan after 2023 were coming out in the preseason last year, or some of it was the middle of the season, and some of it was even during the whole sign stealing stuff, like before Moore was named as the interim, I wanted, outside of maybe Sharon Moore and giving him the job, I wanted Kalen DeBoer or Jonathan Smith. And I think for very good reasons, and the fact that both of them are going to be in the future unanimously viewed as top 5 coaches.
Yeah, because when those rumors were circulating, I hope I'm getting his name right. Is it Matt Campbell, the head coach at Iowa State?
Yeah. Oh no.
Yeah, that's what everyone was saying. But Matt Campbell, like, he should be the Michigan. I was like, absolutely not. No, I would. Oh my God, I would take Jonathan Smith over him 1,000 times out of 1,000. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. He was a guy that I was hoping Michigan would interview if Harbaugh had left, because he's just a really solid coach. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's a former walk-on. He walked on to Oregon State, and I think as their starter, he had a 10 or 11 win season there. He's just a winner, just a straight up winner. So,
yeah, very admirable. Very cerebral, intelligent schemer. And last thing I'll say before we end is his strength and conditioning coach. Talk about something that will make or break programs at the highest level. I think it's been a problem at Ohio State. I think that it's actually been a little bit of a problem, like even at Iowa for the previous few years. They had Chris Doyle, and then the whole like investigation that they had with the whole like racial bias stuff, and then he resigned, they parted ways, and I think they promoted from within, and their offensive line just hasn't been the same. So strength and conditioning is super important. And Mike McDonald at Michigan State, he is one of the better strength and conditioning coaches in the country. And what you said about Oregon State just pounding the rock and low ego but high output, that goes right back to strength and conditioning. So that's another good sign. Thank you for coming on. I appreciated this, and I hope to have you back on soon, particularly in the regular season, as that's when all the fun begins.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Sam. Been watching your stuff for a long time, so when you reached out, it meant a lot. Getting to come on here, and to everybody watching, if you are interested in learning more about my content, like Sam said, Linktree is below. I have an Instagram with just under 20,000 followers. Just started a YouTube channel, so appreciate all you guys.
Yeah, check out his stuff in the link in the description. I'll also post it in the pinned comment right after this stream is over. Thank you all for coming on. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I will see you guys around very soon in the next episode of Touchdown Talk, which